Hello, everyone. Today we are going to talk about interviews. Our team is formed by Arelia Armenta, Celina Guerra, Elisa Gama, and me, Laura Taide. So our roadmap is going to be the following. We're going to start with interview description and types. Then we're going to talk about collecting the data, analyzing data, improving the quality of interviews, and research and participants' roles. And then a brief conclusion. So let's start.
Okay, so I'm going to start with the description. So what are interviews? First, we have for guests a conversation with a purpose, and then Silverman says it is the gold standard for qualitative research. And then we have Vale, a professional conversation. Okay, so next is we have interviews are an important data collection tool used in qualitative research, which can be used for other methods of research, for example, to help design a questionnaire or as informal conversations in an observation research. And it is an essential method for many, many researchers. So what are the types? We have first structured interviews, which seek very specific information and they collect data with as little variation as possible. Um, in this case, they talk about it as it's more of a spoken questionnaire. You have a list of questions, like an itinerary, and you have to follow them. And this improves the rate of response versus a written questionnaire. Then we have open interviews, which are, in this case, the questions are not predetermined. The goal is to explore the respondents' experiences, beliefs, feelings, and etc. In as much depth as possible. And it has general topics. So the interview is determined by the participant. Next, we have the semi-structured interviews. This is the most commonly used in research. It draws from both open and structured interviews. They use an interview guide, which is key topics that must be covered, and it has to be flexible enough to allow probing. This means that to investigate some themes more in depth. And finally, it is best to start with open questions because otherwise the participant gets used to concise answers and it becomes harder to open up later on in the interview. However, it is still important to get acquainted to all three types of interviews and develop the skills and knowledge necessary to choose the best one for your project.
Okay, so we have collecting your data. So as we can see, here are some definitions of what collecting your data is. One that I really like is data collection is a means for gathering facts, statistics, and details from different sources. So there are different steps to follow that researchers have used. For example, as you can see in the map in this little cycle thing, it says collecting data, preparation for interview, setting up the interview, getting the interaction right, and then after the interview. Okay, so all this is like a cycle of collecting data. So if we go to the next slide, you'll be able to see step one. Step one is preparing for an interview. So here are different aspects that we need to take into consideration when preparing for an interview, such as decide the overall aim of the interview and the topics that need to be covered. This is like the most important point, right? We need to know what we're aiming for, and we need to know every aspect that it needs to be covered with the questions that we are going to be preparing. If we organize these topics in a sequential way, we would lead to a natural development of exploration. Also, if we get these general ideas and start reducing them into specifics, we will be able to get a better knowledge of what is trying to be taken out from the interview. And they also suggest us that we use warm-up questions, such as, could you just talk me through? And this would, like in enhance the information that wants to be taken out in a larger context. And also we need to, well, as we always take out the data with ethical issues, we need to have confidentiality and anonymity. So, the letters of consent and all that we need to do so that we can be ethical. So for step 2, we have the scheduling. So time is very important in this setup. So we have time for each interview and reflection and plan after the interview. So time for each interview means if we're going to be with several participants at the time, we'll give them that specific time and not reduce them or cut them off at the very moment. Like always plan time ahead for the interview and the participants. And we need to reflect and plan after the interview that I will be talking a little bit more about that in step number 3, I guess. But it is necessary to consider some time for reflecting after, right after the interview, okay? So in step 3, we have getting the interaction right. So we have maintain control of the interview. So us as interviewers need to have all these questions ready and set for the interviewees, and hoping that this interview leads uh into a into a discussion, but um like flowing naturally. And by using the art of listening, we will be able to, like, little by little comprehend and reflect a little more about what the interviewee is telling us, and we can continue with showing genuine interest. Now this is really a tricky one, because maybe if they sent us to do an interview, maybe we're not so interested in the topic, but if it's a topic that we're going to be um, researching on, well, it's obvious that we're going to be very interested, and we will create this very good ambience for the interviewee to express themselves better. And then we have these very 3 categories. They're very important, which is checking, reflecting, following up, and probing. So checking and reflecting, it's like the easiest way of doing this is simply like to reflect the speaker's own statement back to them. So it's like we make them, like, we assure the ideas again. We can come up with some phrases like, so you're saying that, oh, you mean that, and that way they can confirm us the information. And for step 4, um, after the interview, we really need to have this time for reflection, and, as it says here, record the practical details of the interview: when, where, who, topics discussed, and so on. And then we can do like this summary of our own interview, and we can reflect if we did a good interview or not, such as it says in the text.
Okay, so then we go to analyzing and interpreting your data. So sometimes interviews get a bad rap because they say, well, it's all subjective, but necessarily all research has to have choice and interpretation. It doesn't mean that interviews are just going to have a subjective form. And, a successful analysis is mentioned as one where codes and themes are developed, or main ways of decoding the information that provides interest, and also it allows for certain subjects to be developed. Then we have transcribing. And well, now with the benefit of technology, we have such a great option to go ahead and make sure we transcribe all of these, all of this data, all of this information in a meaningful way, and in a way that we can make sure and follow through to make sure that we don't miss anything. Now, software has been developed in order to go ahead and follow through this type of process. And well, as you're listening to these emerging ideas, you have to come to the data fresh, and you have to allow for categories to naturally take place. And this is done through skimming through transcripts, and we're looking more for accounts rather than reports. And if you can see here in the image of scribbling, they say that that is a great form to go ahead and elaborate specific topics without diving into too many details. And then presenting your findings. This is one of the most important parts of maybe a paper, and it allows for the voice of the participants to emerge clearly, especially in interviews. It is also advised that they use flowcharts, and you can present information diagrammatically. And this is very important because interviews allow for voices that are not usually heard to be able to be done so.
Then we are going to talk about the way of improving the quality of interviews. So there are personal and professional qualities, if we can go to the next slide, please, of the individual interviewer required in quality interviews. According to Legard, Keegan, and Ward, these qualities could be summarized as three, the main ones. The first one is about the ability to listen, which is fundamental for the interviewer to hear, to digest, and comprehend the participants' answers. The second one is a clear and logical mind to think quickly to elicit the essential points. And the third one is a good memory as important attribute to return to the point for further clarification and elaboration. Anyway, there are other aspects that we can consider, and practice is one of the main activities that we can do. How we can do this? A way to start is reflecting on the way that we perform these interviews and identify some aspects that we can or we want to investigate. For example, you can go back to the transcripts and records in order to examine this in more detail. So another thing that we can do, if we go to the next slide, please, is to identify aspects that are typical for the interaction, your interaction style. For example, if you check your audio and you find out that you are interrupting the respondent's turns, or maybe you are sticking too rigidly to the plan, closing the or closing down the conversation, or failing to pick up clues. So this is what we need to check. And it could help us to ask us, what effect do they have in the development of the interview? The questions that we are presenting in the interview, how are affecting the way of the interaction of the interview? If we go to the next slide, we can check also that another strategy that we can use is to ask a colleague to listen to one of our records, our recordings, and they can comment on it, giving us some feedback. We can also analyze these interviews by asking questions designed to check some aspects of the performance. Such questions could include, for example, from the interview, which questions work best and why? What opportunities were missing in the interview and why? How varied and appropriate were your responses? So all these strategies will help us to gain experience in analyzing the way that the questions are in the interview. And also the authors mentioned that usually these interviews are combining with observation in order to help to compare the stated beliefs with the classroom practice. And as a summary of these practices, we can say that a good interviewee will have three characteristics. If we go to the next slide. These characteristics are considerable, sensitive, self-critical, awareness, and openness to change. Let's continue with Elisa, please.
Yes. So next we are going to see the researcher and participant roles. To start, the researcher has to be a facilitator. He has to enable the participants to talk about their thoughts, their feelings, and other things that are necessary for the research. The researcher has to be an active participant. They have to not just let the participant talk, but make sure that all of the important points are covered without influencing the interviewee's views. And they have to define the participant role. So, for example, as the researcher goes on asking questions, the participant gets to know what they have to do in the research. So then we go to the role of the participants. Participants have to provide fulsome answers. So just not go just for yes or no, or maybe they have to go in depth about their answers. They also have to reflect on things. So, for example, if you're giving short answers and the researcher keeps asking why or asking you to go a little bit more in depth, then your role as a participant is to maybe, as the interview goes on, you start like catching up onto that, and then you start making your answers more reflective, longer, and more meaningful to the questions that are being asked to you.
And well, our final thoughts in general, we've seen that, well, interviews as data collection method lie at the heart of qualitative research. It helps you become a better listener. It makes you more aware of more aspects that goes into your research, and it leads to a better understanding of the issues. And well, one of the specific mentions in the article, it says better understanding of yourself and the professional world, which in the end is our final goal. Thank you.